Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to be sharing with you regarding the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and it is as follows. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry proposed a $4 billion economic plan for the Palestinian territories, which would be overseen by former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Blair is the spokesperson for the Middle East Quartet, consisting of the United States, the United Nations, the European Union, and Russia, who has the task of overseeing the peace process. The goal of the plan is to grow the Palestinian economy by up to 50% in the next 3 years, cut unemployment by almost 2/3, and raise average wages by 40%. However, Kerry stressed that the success of the plan depends upon parallel progress with regard to the peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. Kerry also discussed with Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and top peace negotiator Justice Minister Tzipi Livni a package of proposals for restarting peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. Palestinian officials said that Kerry hasn't presented them with details of his initiative for resuming the peace process. The details of the plan hasn't been released to the public. However, Kerry is expected to do so in the first part of June. Nevertheless, sources reveal that Kerry is asking Israel to make concessions to restart the peace talks, which include permitting the Palestinians to build in Jericho for their prospective state an international airport for direct civilian flights to and from the United States and Europe. Those flights would cross Israeli airspace and be coordinated with Israeli flight control authorities. While Palestinian authorities would be in charge of security at the future Jericho airport, Israel would maintain control of passengers and freight traffic by means of computer and surveillance camera networks. Kerry also wants Israel to hand over to the Palestinians the Khalija region on the northern shore of the Dead Sea. This would be the first in a series of land and sovereignty handovers granted the Palestinians in trilateral negotiations between Israel, the Palestinians, and the United States. The Palestinians remain skeptical of both Kerry's economic and diplomatic efforts. A senior Fatah official criticized Kerry's talk about economic prosperity for the Palestinians, saying, "We have to be clear that we don't want this economic peace. We are not animals that only want food. We are people struggling for our freedom." Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas's economic advisor, Mohammed Mustafa, said the Palestinian leadership will not offer political concessions in exchange for economic benefits. "We will not accept that the economy is the primary and sole component of the conflict." Mustafa said that the Palestinian priorities are not economic, but rather a political framework for the creation of a Palestinian state based upon 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital and the return of Palestinian refugees. Chief Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat said, "I don't think there is anything called economic peace or security peace or political peace. They are all intertwined with each other. The Palestinians will only agree to resume peace negotiations if Israel freezes settlement construction and declares that the pre-1967 borders will be the starting point for direct peace negotiations." Furthermore, Kerry is still not prepared to present a new U.S. peace initiative. Erekat further said, "The question now is whether Kerry will be able to persuade Netanyahu to accept the two-state solution on the basis of the pre-1967 borders." Palestinian negotiator Nabil Sha'ath said, "Kerry won't succeed in rekindling peace talks unless he pressures Israel to halt settlement activity and accept a two-state solution based upon the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital." This is not the first time that the United States or the Europeans have tried to play the economic card in an effort to get the Palestinians to make concessions to Israel. Billions of dollars that were given to the Palestinians over the past 2 decades have not had a moderating effect on the Palestinians. The United States and the Europeans are clearly not listening to what the Palestinians are telling them, saying that dollars and euros will not change the hearts hearts and minds of the Palestinian mindset. This does not mean, of course, that the Palestinians will refuse what they are being offered. They will take the money, but at the end of the day, they will continue to stick to their demands, including the right of return of Palestinian refugees and a full Israeli withdrawal to the pre-1967 borders. Regarding his approach to the peace process, Kerry told Israeli President Shimon Peres at the World Economic Forum held in Amman, Jordan, that our hope is that the leaders of both Israel and the Palestinians will find a way to compromise. It's really a question of whether Israel and the Palestinians are willing to make the hard choices for peace. Israel top peace negotiator Tzipi Livni said that the international community, especially Europe, must pressure Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to directly negotiate with Israel. It's the only way to have negotiations, she said. Israel's position has been that talks should be resumed without preconditions. If the Palestinians insist on imposing conditions on the resumption of talks, then Israel will also present them with their demands. Although Livni could not give details of her conversations with Kerry about the resumption of peace talks, she did say that the Palestinians would prefer to see a map of how Israel envisions the borders of its state before peace talks can once again begin. They also do not want a phased agreement or temporary borders, she said. Broadly speaking, Israel believes that Palestinian refugees should be absorbed by the Palestinians and not within Israel proper. Israel also wants to retain the large Jewish settlement blocks in the West Bank. Also, any agreement must address Israel's security needs. Finally, Livni said that Hamas cannot be a partner to any peace talks. Israel must work with the international community to delegitimize Hamas, she said. Yuval Steinitz, a senior Israeli cabinet minister, said that the Israeli government supports the two states for two peoples solution to resolve the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Israel is ready to make painful concessions on two conditions: that there will be peace and security, he said. Genuine peace would entail a real recognition of Israel as a Jewish state and the end of all claims and incitement against Israel. Israel's security requirements include a total demilitarization of a future Palestinian state. Israel would have the right to supervise and control that arrangement in order to be able to prevent arms smuggling or any other negative security developments in the West Bank, he said. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Israel is prepared to make compromises for genuine peace, but their desire to compromise is not being reciprocated by the Palestinians. Meanwhile, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said that he is under intense international pressure to return to negotiations with Israel and drop demands for a Jewish settlement freeze in the West Bank. Israel has approved building tenders for the construction of 300 new homes in Jerusalem and plans to build more housing units beyond the Green Line, which is the pre-1967 borders. In response to this, the United States said, "We do not accept the legitimacy of continued Israeli settlement construction, which undermines efforts to achieve peace and is contrary to the obligations that Israel undertook upon itself." It is President Obama's opinion that Israel should recognize that the settlement policy is not conducive to achieving peace and hampers the Palestinian chances of establishing a state on sustainable borders. In our opinion, the two sides must take confidence-building measures which will make it possible to resume direct peace talks. Palestinian chief negotiator Saeb Erekat said, "The Palestinians consider the recent decision of the Israeli government to build 1,000 homes in East Jerusalem as effectively destroying the efforts of U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry's efforts for the past 2 months to resume Palestinian and Israel direct peace talks." Because of these developments, British Foreign Secretary William Hague warned of the risk of failure of the U.S.-sponsored mission to revive the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, suggesting it was the last attempt possible at reaching a two-state solution to the conflict and that there was no realistic Plan B. Haig said that Kerry's drive to restart talks was a moment of opportunity that won't easily come around again. He later repeated the same point. If this effort doesn't work, there is not going to be another moment in American diplomacy that is more committed and energetic to bring about the resumption of peace talks. So it's very important in weeks, not months, to make the most of this opportunity. The two-state solution is slipping away. It doesn't have much longer to go. We never like to say it's the last attempt at anything, but we're getting near the last attempt at this, Haig said. It is vital for all sides to make the necessary compromises for negotiations for a two-state solution to succeed. So U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has just concluded 2 months of talks with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. During that time, he has met privately and spoke on the phone with each of them at least 10 times. When Kerry finished his recent conversations with Netanyahu and Abbas in the past week, he indicated that he wants an answer within 1 to 2 weeks whether Netanyahu and Abbas will agree on parameters to restart direct peace talks. Kerry said that Netanyahu and Abbas needs to think about the hard decisions that each side needs to make. Kerry said that we need to allow folks time to make their decisions within a reasonable framework within the next few days ahead of us. Based upon the information that we've been given, what likely would Kerry be proposing to restart direct peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians? Well, in the past 2 months, Kerry has suggested the following. Israel and the Palestinians will renew direct peace talks without preconditions. During the talks, the parties will refrain from provocative statements or actions which Kerry said takes us backwards in the process. Meaning, the Palestinians will avoid incitement against Israel, while Israel will stay away from things like conducting massive construction in the settlements, legalizing outposts, or demolishing Palestinian homes. Negotiations will be held first on determining the borders of a future Palestinian state and Israel's needed security arrangements. The guiding principle of the talks, Kerry said, will be to integrate Israeli demands with Palestinian demands along the 1967 lines with agreed land swaps and recognizing changes that have taken place on the ground. In other words, the land swaps should take into consideration the large Jewish settlement blocks in the West Bank. Kerry stressed that he does not want the issue of construction in the settlements to become a precondition that will prevent the resumption of talks. Because, he said, if you can negotiate borders, and if you negotiate security and get to a final settlement, you have resolved the issue of the settlements themselves. The way to resolve the issue, Kerry said, is by deciding what would be a Palestinian state and the things that would be a part of it, and what would a state of Israel look like and the things associated with it. However, Kerry did make clear to Netanyahu that he expects to see Israel to take steps that indicate a willingness to try to move forward. Kerry did not demand a full freeze on construction in the settlements, including private construction, but he does expect Netanyahu to show restraint that would manifest itself in stopping government tenders for new homes. With regard to construction in the settlements, Kerry said, "We believe that they should stop," and said that such actions are not necessarily constructive with respect to renewing the peace process. Finally, regarding Israeli domestic issues, the election and coalition debate regarding how ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students will be drafted in the Israeli military is being considered to be put into Israeli law. Yair Lapid, the leader of the political party Yesh Atid, which means there's a future, said, "Yesh Atid will not sit in a coalition government not willing to act on the issue of the equal share of the burden, meaning equal military service for all Israelis. There is an historic opportunity to right an historic wrong of ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students not serving in the Israeli military." Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has expressed a willingness to make whatever compromises are necessary to pass the bill. Well, that is going to conclude this week's update where we shared with you the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.